Welcome to the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, SEATINI, expert podcast series, where we reimagine trade as a tool for people, planet, and shared prosperity. In this episode, we turn our focus to a topic that is more transformative, more urgent than ever before: advancing agroecology through trade policy. We are broadcasting live from Uganda, the Pearl of Africa. How can agroecology be placed at the center of trade policy? And to help us navigate this timely and critical conversation is Dr. David Luke, an expert on African trade policy, the director of Firoz Lalji Institute at the London School of Economics, and he has recently published a very critically important book that is titled How Africa Eats. Welcome, Dr. Luke.
Yeah, thank you very much, Herbert. I'm delighted to be here on the banks of the Great Lake Victoria. So I'm just delighted to be here and to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. So I think let's get started. How can trade policies be reimagined to work for agroecology, but also how can agroecological principles be embedded in trade policies, like the African Continental Free Trade Area?
Well, firstly, of course, I understand by agroecology, you're talking about sustainable agriculture, basically. And how can that be made to work for the AfCFTA and more broadly agricultural production in Africa? I think the first point to make is that the farming model on this continent is primarily smallholder farming model. I know that some see it as a problem, that commercialized farming needs much scaled up types of approaches. But I take a different view, and in the book How Africa Eats, we take the view that the smallholder farming model is not a problem. The problem with African food security is not a production problem as such. It's the support that is provided to the farming model that we receive. So, of course, this support, especially since you're emphasizing the issue of sustainability, should not only be in terms of the inputs that farmers need to enhance their productivity, but also in relation to the kinds of techniques that could advance sustainability. That includes, of course, how water resources are used, because there are smart ways of doing this. There are smart ways of engaging in farming practices that are sustainable and so on. So small farmers do need this kind of support, and they can be just as productive as any other farming model if this support is forthcoming. And I think our main argument in the book is that this support has been lacking, and we do show the gaps, major gaps in investment, in finance, in supports for inputs, but also on the output side in relation to post-harvest storage, post-harvest marketing, and so on. There are institutional gaps that need to be addressed in order for not only the productivity of the farmers, but in order for African agriculture to be, for production to be scaled up. So we see this as the genesis or the basis, if you like, of the challenge that faces African agriculture. So it's not so much the small farming model, but many other factors that can help drive sustainability.
You've talked about the whole issue of the smallholder model that we have. It's the reality on the continent. However, there are growing calls for African governments to adopt the other model of agriculture, industrial model of agriculture, which is fertilizer intensive, and of course it's connected to monoculture. But what happens to food security? What happens to food sovereignty? Because at the center of agroecology is the whole issue of farmers' rights. But increasingly, a number of trade-related policy frameworks are threatening farmers' rights.
Yes, we are seeing that this is beginning to happen. But the main point is that farmers with the right incentives will respond to incentives just like any other agricultural agent. And indeed, the current model where the concentration is on commodities that are exported, you mentioned this monocultural system that has been followed for a number of years that we need to break away from. So I think farmers respond to incentives and will respond to incentives that prioritize food security. So again, I come back to this basic argument that the issue is not a production issue. There is a broader political economy issue that is stifling the growth of agricultural production. Africa is yet to have a green revolution, so to say, that underscores that we have reached a threshold of production and productivity at a much higher level. We've seen this happen in other parts of the world, and this has not necessarily been on the basis of commercial, large-scale commercial agriculture. If you take India, for example, small-scale farmers are the heart of what everybody recognizes as the green revolution in India. So I think there are these sort of models that we could learn from in other parts of the world. The other aspect is you did mention the reality of the smallholder farming model, which is tied to our land tenure systems, which is community based, and as you know, there have been issues around trying to aggregate land for commercial purposes, which means in effect driving away small holders from their land. So I think there are these sorts of tensions which I think we need to avoid. Other parts of the continent, of course, where you have had settler type driven production, you can see the tensions that have arisen in terms of access to land and so on. But in much of Africa, we don't have that problem, and I don't think it's a problem that we should create, but we should build upon what's there. Even as in the settler model in Southern Africa, efforts are being made to restore a balance. So from that perspective, I think really you come back to the issue of the kind of support that farmers can receive.
Thank you so much. Let's ground this discussion in your latest research and recent publication, How Africa Eats. How do the current trade policies in Africa engage with or contradict agroecological practices?
Basically, what is currently happening is that we're exporting agricultural commodities to earn the foreign exchange to import food. So basically, this is what is happening. I think 44 African countries net food importers, and basically this is the model that is being followed. So I think there is scope to break away from that model. Prioritize food security because we are losing the foreign exchange that we're earning. It makes no sense, to follow that practice. And in the context of promoting inter-African trade with the African Continental Free Trade Area, the market is there, the population is there, the evidence shows that, in fact, growth right now in Africa is being driven by consumption, so the market is there. So I think it will be just as important to prioritize the African market, meet the food security needs. That does not mean that we neglect altogether exporting agricultural commodities. We can still export agricultural commodities, hopefully in processed form rather than basic commodities. So agricultural trade, when you break it down to the food security component, commercial exports and so on, we can have a good mix of both. They're not mutually exclusive, but we have not been able to arrive at that model. And as I say, the AfCFTA is a good opportunity to be able to do this. Our research shows that because tariffs are already low, the AfCFTA per se will not lead to an increase in agricultural trade, in food trade as such. However, we do still have non-tariff barriers, whether it's border issues at customs, trade facilitation, logistics. Agricultural products generally are perishable, so you do need to have good logistics, efficient border processes, etc. So there is scope to scale that up if we deal with the non-tariff barriers. And I think the AfCFTA provides that framework. Even at the regional level, under the REX, we are seeing much of the trade that is going on is agricultural and food trade, with a mix of both food security items as well as other type of commodities. So I think we need to keep this mix, but we need to urgently address the problem of food security.
Thank you so much. You've talked about the whole issue of having a mix of both the other products and agroecological products on the market. But also there is a challenge that there is no system of recognizing and verifying agroecological products. What needs to be done in order for agroecological products to be fully recognized in the policies, agroecological principles to be embedded within trade policies, but also on the market for agroecological products to be recognizable?
Sure. Here again, the AfCFTA, I think the overall framework of trade regulations that it is putting into place could be very helpful in relation to the standards that we're building into sanitary, phytosanitary processes. Much of the agricultural production on the African continent is chemical-free production. Being careful here, I'm not saying fertilizer-free, but chemical-free, and I think there's scope to build on that, but then we need to have the common regulatory framework. The AfCFTA provides for that, but we need to work on that to ensure that the regulatory framework and the standards do meet global standards. We got global standards on these issues under, for example, the International Standards Organization. And actually, if we're able to do this, we can even earn a premium on the products that we trade among ourselves and even that we export out of the continent. So again, I see an opportunity here that we need to pursue. But as with many of these things, it does require African governments coming together and working out the basics that need to be done.
Thank you so much. In your view, what are the most pressing trade-related constraints and how can they be addressed?
I think the most pressing trade-related constraints are the non-tariff barriers. Within the African continent, as I've said, the tariff reduction commitments that African countries are supposed to make under the AfCFTA does mean that tariffs are not the issue and even within the REX, there's been substantial liberalization, so tariffs are not the issue. The issue for us are the non-tariff barriers, which we've already talked about in relation to standards, but also in relation to, as I said, trade facilitation processes, logistics, infrastructure. I think these are the challenges that we face. And by the way, these challenges, it's not as if nothing is being done, because much is already happening. We are seeing along the trade corridors, even here in East Africa, we know that the two main corridors, the Central Corridor and the Northern Corridor, there have been considerable improvements in relation to the logistics, in relation to border crossings and so on within these corridors. So a lot is already happening, but what now needs to happen is to scale what we're beginning to see.
Thank you. When we were starting, I hinted on the fact that this episode of the SEATINI podcast series focuses on reimagining trade policy as a tool for people, planet, and also shared prosperity. But in that context, how can trade policies be reimagined to be more inclusive? And how does an inclusive trade policy look like? One that works for the people, for the environment, but also ecological resilience?
Yeah, I think in the emerging trade policy, we need to also keep in mind that trade derives from the productive sectors of the economy, whether agriculture that we're talking about, but also manufacturing and services as well. So the first point I think in terms of imagining trade policy is that we need to expand production in these sectors. And we need to do so in a way that is sustainable, taking advantage of green and climate friendly approaches that are there, using technology in a way that could enhance productivity, and there are many ways in which technology could be brought in. Earlier we talked about smart agriculture. Much of that is based on using technology in a new and dynamic way. So I think the first issue for reimagining trade policy is to build up productive capacity, which is a challenge for many of our countries. Then I think the second issue is that we have to break away from this model of exporting raw materials to the rest of the world. So that also means that as we're building capacity, we're trying to diversify our economies, add value to commodities, and including in this instance agricultural commodities and so on. So I think that has to be part of the reimagination. The trade policy itself, which is not only what happens at the border, but also beyond the border in terms of the various other measures that can support a robust trade regime. I think that too needs more work. We've already talked about standards. We've already talked about the trade facilitation, improving processes, and so on. So I think that all of these together would be part of reimagining trade policy. So I'm just being careful here to say that we are not isolating trade policy, but I think we need to put trade policy in the broader context of reimagining, if you like, the African economy, which of course also we're here at the Development Finance Conference, which of course also includes what we've been talking about in this conference, how African savings could be used better to drive the production and productive processes. So I think the reimagining has to be done in a holistic way and not just isolate trade policy, because isolating trade policy without the linkages that are required to the real economy, yes, would not work.
Thank you so much. One often overlooked area is the role of civil society organizations and smallholder farmers in shaping trade policy. How can these constituencies, civil society on one hand and smallholder farmers on the other hand, meaningfully influence trade policies to elevate agroecology and also localized food systems?
Yeah. When you look at the political economy of your typical African country, where there is a strong alliance between civil society and farmers in the agricultural sector, I think you have the basis also for driving progressive, if you like, agricultural policies and trade policies. I emphasize the importance of the alliance because there are many other forces that play out in the African political economy context in relation to the pressures that policymakers face. On the one hand, you have urban dwellers who are quite active and vocal and do want stable food prices and so on, which is often in contradiction to what farmers want. So we have this sort of challenges and contradictions between rural producers, urban dwellers, and so on. And I don't want to just give a simple model. I know that it's more complex than that, but the underlying point is that civil society with progressive trade policies could have a strong alliance with the rural sector, with farmers, in driving progressive outcomes. I think what we're looking for at this point of reimagining Africa's future in relation to both economy, trade, and so on is to see how we can drive reformist policies that are also progressive, and as you say, that are inclusive, that benefit much of the population. So I think these are the issues and the challenges that we need to face.
Thank you. Looking ahead, really, what policy shifts offer the greatest promise for African countries to elevate agroecology beyond the CFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area? What policy shifts and innovations offer the greatest potential and promise?
Yeah. I think the first point is that we have to recognize that the future, despite again current challenges to what a sustainable future would look like, but the future definitely lies with sustainability. I think the future is going to be greener than we have seen, and I think we need to prepare for that. And I think there's a great opportunity for African countries as a latecomer to the development process, already to build in or to bake into the reforms that they're making and the policies that they're pursuing, in a sense, as you would say, to future-proof these policies, because, despite reactions that you get from some parts of the political spectrum, dealing with climate change is a reality and it's not going to go away. And I think especially issues around adaptability is something that African countries need to prioritize. So I'll put a great deal of emphasis on this, adapting to climate change is key, and we are already seeing that this is well understood, because if you look at nationally determined contributions for a number of countries, if you look at their plans, you see that adaptation is high up there. But of course also there are other factors that are just as important on the mitigation side as well. But clearly we need to future-proof policies, and I think that has to be the direction of travel.
Thank you so much. Regarding the issue of future-proofing policies, there's been increasing debate around greening trade policies. How can Africa achieve greening trade policies?
Myself, I think that this has to be done in a multilateral context. Unfortunately, we are not seeing this. I think many countries sort of taking unilateral action. I think that the transition has to be, and indeed, as use the phrase that is in the Paris Agreement itself, it has to be a just transition. That means that does not mean, of course, that Africa does nothing. Already I mentioned we can see from the ambition in the nationally determined contributions that African countries are already very much in that space. But I think that these are issues that we need to resolve in a multilateral context. Unfortunately, right now, as you know, there's so much fragmentation in the international system, and so even the Conference of the Parties process, we are not seeing a meeting of minds on these things. And we are seeing pushback from, again, the politics of all of this is quite complex in many countries, pushback and strong constituencies for that. But, for much of Africa, these are not issues that are contentious. So I think African countries are in a good space when it comes to that. But there has to be consistency in the policies and in the implementation, etc.
Thank you so much. You've underscored the issue of consistency in policies. if you were to advise African governments at this point in time, what policy priorities do we need in order to salvage the situation?
I think what Africa needs is really to implement the policies that are already there. Again, if you look at the typical African vision, country vision statement, where the country wants to be in a number of years in the future. If you look at the national development plans, if you look at the nationally determined contributions, you look at all these policy and planning frameworks, so much thinking has gone on. To some extent, some prioritization has also gone on. I think the challenge is implementation. That is now the big challenge in my view. And that's where, the point I made earlier about policy consistency and so on. So I think really it's not a question now of inventing new policies. Of course, you have to adapt to changes in the global environment. So that kind of adaptation will be ongoing, is built in, so to say. But I don't think it's a question of the policies. I think now it's a question of implementation. So if you ask me, I'll say implementation. That to me has to be the mantra. And to, sort of also build upon changes that are happening and be able to drive those forward, to learn from the changes and to be able to see how best to navigate the future as it unfolds. So I think that key aspect of building our institutions that can support implementation. Also moving to a model where we are trying to rely more on African financial resources, which is needed in order to be able to implement policies and so on. So I think that is the kind of shift that we should be making. And basically I think, again, referencing the context in which we're having this discussion, the Uganda Development Finance Summit, much of the discussion has been about, yes, indeed, how you can use indigenous finance to drive the development process. So that, of course, has to be an important part of the implementation solution, if I could put it that way. Yeah.
Thank you. Lastly, there's an issue of agency, African agency, being one of the critical issues that we need to talk about. So how can we assert African agency?
In this, actually, I think this is one area where I think African governments have done well to some extent. I think they've been trying to navigate the changing geopolitical setting in a way that we're building a number of partnerships, including new partnerships we're seeing with, for example, the Gulf region and so on. So I think they're being careful to navigate these changes in a way that they could maximize the benefits that they're getting from for development and so on. I think so. African agency has been going in the right direction. I think the challenge is that they have not been doing this in a concerted way. So I think that has been the challenge, in the sense that there's too much fragmentation in the way that
no unified voice.
Yeah, exactly. They sort of to speak with one voice, as the AU declarations tend to say and so on. That is not happening. And I think that is having an effect on the leverage that African countries can actually bring in engaging with partners. So I think that is what is missing, and that's where now we need to see African agency going in a direction of taking concerted action, building upon the kind of individual approaches, which I think by and large have been in the right direction, building upon the individual approaches. So I think that is what now we need to see. We need to give the African Union more teeth. The Commission, does not have a mandate to act on behalf of the African countries, and we do have the African Union is what we have as the coordinating body, but on the continent. So I think we need to use it more. We used to need it to use it strategically. Those who have tried to work in a concerted way have reported on the bruises and wounds that they have that they've had in the process. It's not been easy, and in a sense also I think Africa's interlocutors are content with seeing Africa divided, because that's a good way of maintaining the status quo as far as Africa is concerned. So if really we want to change the status quo, we have to act in a more concerted way, recognizing that that we are marginal players individually on the global scene, but concerted action will give some leverage, as I say.
Thank you so much, Dr. David Luke, for this thought-provoking conversation. You have not only illuminated problems that we are facing now, but also provided some very good positions and solutions that we could actually take to salvage the situation.
Good.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.